Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to be talking about necromancy. This is the first of a two-part series. Today I'm going to be talking about Animate Dead specifically, and this is going to kind of go in my Dungeons & Dragons Mechanics series. My name is Nathan, and let's get started. So here's what we're going to be covering today. I'm going to be kind of doing a general intro to necromancy and kind of what that is. I'll talk about some considerations for DMs around necromancy, as it can be kind of complicated, and then we'll dive into detail about Animate Dead, kind of how it works, what your options are, and kind of what kind of damage Animate Dead can output just by itself if you only focus on it. So intro to necromancy. What is necromancy in general? So generally speaking, we're talking about summoning undead, typically from corpses or piles of bones. Now, importantly, these are concentration-free summoned creatures that have no reliance on your spellcasting stat, and they have no expiration date. Now, importantly, the number you can control at a time is limited, but generally speaking, you can summon and control potentially very large groups if given enough time to prepare and you invest enough spellcasting resources. Now, there are two main spells that do this. There's the Animate Dead, which we're going to be covering today, and then Create Undead, which is going to be what we're going to be covering in the second part of the series. Now, some things to consider for DMs around this whole thing in general. So the first thing you have to consider is corpse access. If you have a player that wants to animate large amounts of undead creatures and do necromancy, something you're going to have to consider is how often are they going to be able to get access to corpses to do this. The next important thing is the reactions of the non-player characters in your world, as well as, of course, how the other players are going to react. Are the people in a town going to react positively if your, wizard walks in with an army of skeletons behind them? The answer to that question is probably no. So if you have a player that's going to be doing this, you need to have some kind of discussion about when is going to be appropriate to bring the army along, and how are you going to manage that kind of aspect of it. Because in most worlds, most non-player characters are not going to be comfortable with having undead around. Another thing you have to consider is, are the summons proficient with weapons and armor? Now, we know from the monster manual, which is where the summons from Animate Dead come from, they're also in the back of the player's handbook, that monsters are proficient with the gear that they are listed to have. But the question becomes, are they proficient with other weapons and armor if they know how to use them? And so that's a question that you as a DM will have to cover. And if you want to play a build like this is an important thing to talk about with your DM. If you can equip your summons with other weapons or other armor, you can potentially make them significantly stronger than they are already. Now, in terms of actual practical things, in terms of how the game works, one thing you have to consider as the DM is how much the summons are going to clutter the action economy. If you have a player who has, 10 or more skeletons behind them, how are you going to handle that? Are they going to all act on their own turn? Are you going to make the player roll the dice for all their attacks and that kind of thing? And as the number of summons increases, this player's turns will start to take longer and longer if you don't have some kind of way to plan. So if you're the DM and your player wants to do this, or you're a player who wants to do this, talk to your DM about this and see if you can figure out a way to work around it. Another important consideration is space clogging. You're potentially going to have a lot of summons if your DM is willing to let you have a lot of them, and you will clog up the battlefield like no other, in addition to the turn order. So again, this has to go with considerations of when you can appropriately use the Animate Dead, or just large herds of summons in general. If you've got big, large, open battlefields, they work very well, but they might not work so well in the crowded rooms and corridors of an underground dungeon or cave. Another thing to consider is the micromanagement of controlling them and the timing of that. Typically, necromancy spells, the creatures that you create, are under your control for 24 hours, and then you lose control of them after that unless you basically cast a spell on them to keep them under your control. So how much do you want to micromanage that timing aspect, as well as potentially their inventory, if they are proficient with other items and that kind of thing? And yeah, gear and health management on the summons can be a big deal. where, like, let's say our player is animating skeletons, which is one of the things that Animate Dead does. Where does their gear come from? Does the player need to provide it? Do they need to keep track of how many arrows the skeletons have fired? And then tracking all of their health bars, again, can be a concern, especially as the player. There are ways that players can make relatively durable summons, and if the summons don't die in one hit, tracking the health of a lot of summons can be a headache. So that's another practical thing to consider if you're going to either have a player who does this, or you're a player who wants to do this. That's an important thing to consider. So let's go into the specifics of how the Animate Dead spell works. So this in particular is a 3rd level necromancy spell. I've kind of written out the full text here, and we'll kind of go through the highlights. But it takes a minute to cast, which means you're not going to be able to do it in combat. Has a range of 10 feet. Takes vocal, somatic, and material components, but none of those material components have a cost. So if you have a spellcasting focus, you are right around that. So what this spell does is it creates an undead servant from a pile of bones or a corpse of a medium or small creature. You raise them as an undead creature, either a skeleton from bones or a zombie from corpses. On your turns, you can issue a bonus action to mentally command any creature you made with this spell if the creature is within 60 feet of you. And if you control multiple creatures, you can issue the same command to any of them or all of them at the same time, issuing the same command to each one. And we can decide what action the creature will take and where it will move during its next turn, or we can issue a general command, such as to guard a particular chamber or corridor. And if we issue no commands, the creature only defends itself against hostile creatures, and once given an order, it will follow it until its task is complete. The creature will be under our control for 24 hours, after which it will stop obeying any commands. And to maintain control of the creature for another 24 hours, we must cast the spell again on the creature before the current 24-hour period ends. And when you do it in this way, you can reassert control over up to 4 creatures you have animated with the spell rather than animating a new one. And at higher levels, the number of creatures we can animate or control with a single cast of the spell increases by 2 for each level over 3rd. Now, there's some important things here, and I've highlighted the big ones, and we'll cover them in a little more detail now. So what are the key mechanics of Animate Dead? So the first one is the enduring general command. The fact that we can issue a general command, such as to guard a particular chamber or corridor, means that we should be able to issue some kind of general command like follow me and attack what I attack. So some kind of general command like that. You should be able to give your skeletons or your zombies some kind of general command like that, so you won't have to use your bonus action every turn in combat to take precise control. So that's going to be that's one of the important key things here is you shouldn't have to do anything on your turn if you've given the right general command. Now, it is a bonus action to change the command, so it's not really that big of a deal if you wanted to order a subgroup of your skeletons to focus on a different target or something like that. That shouldn't be a problem. And then the quantity of summons of minions that we can create from a single cast is 2 times our spell level -2 -1. So at 3rd level, that will be 1, and then at 4th level, that will be 3, and so forth. And the number that we can reassert control over is 2 times the spell level -1. So a 3rd level slot gets us 4, a 4th level slot gets us 6, etc. Now, this spell is available to wizards and clerics on their core spell list. There are a few other subclasses that get it. The Oathbreaker Paladin has access to this spell. They are a half-caster, so they will get it much later. The Spores Druid has access to this spell, and Bards potentially have access to this spell through the Magical Secrets feature. Now, the main one I'm going to be focusing on looking at here as we do our kind of progression are going to be the Wizards and the Clerics and the Paladin. The Druid and the Bard will have very similar progression numbers to the Cleric, so I'm not going to cover those specifically in detail. So what are our options for Animate Dead? So the first option, and in my opinion this one is the best, is the Skeleton. This is a CR 1/4 creature raised from a pile of bones. They have an armor class of 13, and they come with armor scraps, and they have health of 13, which is 2d8 plus 4, a speed of 30 feet. We are able to infer that their proficiency modifier is +2 from their stats. They have a strength of 10, a dexterity of 15, a constitution of 15, an intelligence of 6, a wisdom of 8, and a charisma of 5. They are vulnerable to bludgeoning damage and immune to poison damage and the poisoned condition. They have dark vision out to a range of 60 feet and a passive perception of 9. Now, skeletons by default in the monster manual come with a short sword, which is a +4 to hit. So they're using their dexterity here. So it's going to be 2 + 2 proficiency. And it does 1d6 + 2 piercing damage, which is the standard for a short sword. They also have a short bow, again, +4 to hit using dexterity, and 1d6 + 2 piercing. Now, the important things here is, again, discuss with your DM or discuss with your player about where the skeleton's equipment comes from. Is it magically created when the skeleton is animated, or does the skeleton need to pick up those things from nearby? So if you animated different piles of bones, maybe you're going to get different weapons and that kind of thing. So the question really becomes, again, this is something you need to clarify, is what are the skeletons proficient with armor-wise? And what are they proficient with weapon-wise? Because in theory, if we assume they're proficient with everything, you could equip these with half plate, give them an armor class of 17, then give them a shield, give them an armor class of 19 if you want to make a melee skeleton, and then give them a rapier for 1d8 + 2 damage, or give them something like a longbow or a heavy crossbow and that kind of thing. So, again, talk with your DM about what the skeletons are proficient with. This is a huge thing and very important. Now, the other option that you can create is a zombie. They have an armor class of 8. They have 22 health. They're significantly slower. They have better strength, way worse dex, and their stats are kind of generally worse across the board. They are proficient in wisdom saves and immune to the poison damage and the poison condition. They have the Undead Fortitude feature, which lets them make a Constitution save if they're reduced to 0 hit points, and then if they make it, they can potentially sit back up at 1. And they have a +3 to hit and do 1d6 + 1 bludgeoning damage. Now, generally speaking, the skeletons are much better, in my opinion, both for damage because they have a higher hit chance and do a little bit more damage because their modifier is higher, and for defensive purposes because they have a higher armor class and they're faster. So I'm not going to be focusing on using zombies, and if you want to use this spell, I highly recommend focusing on skeletons going forward. So what is the general damage output of this spell? So I have made a calculator for this that I'm using as the basis of this. One of the cool things about this is the damage of the skeletons doesn't really change as you level up, with the exception of one case. And so we can see the damage output here versus a variety of ACs and whether or not you have advantage or not. Now, when I'm doing these numbers, I am not going to be assuming we have advantage, and we're just making straight rolls. So let's jump into it, and I'm going to show kind of what the damage output of this spell is like if you're going to be focusing on it exclusively at our main damage thresholds like we would do on our other builds. So that's going to be level 6, level 9, level 13, and level 17. So at level 6, a cleric or another full caster would have 3 third-level spell slots. This would enable them to sustain an army at max efficiency of 8 skeletons. Now, the way that I'm calculating these numbers is I'm assuming we're using all of our spell slots of 3rd level or higher, except for 1, to maintain our army. So we would be using 2 of our 3rd level slots to maintain our army here, and so that gives us 2 times 4 or 8 skeletons, and it would take us 5 total days to raise that kind of army. Now, a group of 8 skeletons would do 34.4 DPR against an armor class of 10, and against an armor class of 15, it would be 23.4. Now, the other thing I'm looking at here is the Wizard, and specifically the Necromancer subclass. So the Necromancer subclass at this level has a feature that says any creature they animate with a Necromancy spell gets extra health equal to their level, and does extra damage equal to their proficiency modifier. And it also when they cast Animate Dead, they can animate 1 additional corpse per casting. So they can create 2 corpses per casting with the 3rd level slot. So a Necromancer Wizard. Now, wizards have the Arcane Recovery feature, which lets them recover a spell slot equal to half their wizard level, like once per long rest, and it happens at the end of a short rest. So a wizard essentially has 4 3rd level slots at this level, and therefore can use 3 of them to animate skeletons. So a wizard in particular would be able to support 12 skeletons, and a Necromancer Wizard would take only 2 days to summon this army, and against an armor class of 10, these 12 skeletons would do 78.6 damage per round, and against an armor class of 15, it would be 53.1 DPR. And these are very solid numbers. The skeletons actually do a lot of damage, especially when you start adding that little bit of flat damage on there like the Necromancer can. Now at level 9, the Paladin is now joining the fray. Our Cleric or other full casters that have access to this spell could get 34 skeletons at this level. And again, that's using all of our spells, 3rd level and higher, except for 1 to maintain. So that's going to be 2/3, 3/4, and 1/5. The Cleric or the full caster would take 5 days to assemble this army, and against an armor class of 10 would do 146.2 DPR, and against an armor class of 16 would do 90.1 DPR. And again, these are very solid numbers, but remember, you're committing, in this case, 6 spell slots to maintain this army. Now, our friend the Necromancer Wizard at level 9, their Arcane Recovery has been boosted to 5th level at this point, which means they essentially have 3/3, 3/4, and 2 5th level spell slots for their army. Their army of skeletons is now capped at 42, and those skeletons each get +9 health and do +4 damage. So again, because the Necromancer can raise Animate Dead faster, it would take them 2 days to assemble this army of 42, assuming they had access to enough piles of bones, and they would do 306.6 DPR against an armor class of 10 and 186.9 DPR against an armor class of 16. Now, important to note, I'm not applying any concentration spells or any kind of other buffs to the skeletons, and I'm not debuffing the enemies in any way to get advantage or anything like that. This is just straight rolls shooting with arrows. And yeah, that is a lot of damage, and you can kind of see how much damage this wizard could potentially pump out. Now, again, 42 skeletons is a lot of skeletons. I think I, as a DM, would start to get concerned if it was anywhere over 10. So you taking that into account when looking at these numbers, it'll take a lot of time and effort to not only manage all of these skeletons, but to just run a combat encounter that has 42 skeletons on the side of the player's party. Now, our Paladin Oathbreaker at this level, they can get 4 skeletons because they only have 2 3rd level slots, but they would have their Aura of Hate, and I'm going to assume that that gives their skeletons +5 damage. And as you can see, their damage numbers are pretty low, 32.2 and 19.6 against the higher armor class. But moving on to level 13, our 2 full casters are up to 7th level spells, and our Cleric can now harness Divine Power to get a 3rd level slot back. So our Cleric could have 68 skeletons. Our other full casters would be sitting at 64. And that would get them very close to 300 DPR against an armor class of 10 at 292 and 161.5 against an armor class of 17. And with this amount of spell slots, it would take them 3 days to raise that army of 68. Now, our Necromancer Wizard, due to that extra spell slot, they can now have 72 skeletons at +13 hit points and +5 damage. It would take them a meager 2 days to raise this army, and they are sitting pretty at 579.6 DPR against an armor class of 10 and 315 against an armor class of 17. These are pretty crazy numbers, but again, this is a lot of skeletons, and it may not be practical to bring 72 skeletons into a given combat encounter. That's a lot of space. For context, that's like an 8x9 area of squares on a 5-foot grid that would be entirely occupied with skeletons. Or, 36x2 if you're doing like a big long line. Our friend the Paladin is sitting, with very limited spell slots, can make 18 skeletons. And for this, I'm just assuming they all get the Aura of Hate, even though they basically have to do like a merry-go-round and walk around the target. But assuming that they have that, they can get this army of 18 in 4 days, and they get 144.9 DPR against an armor class of 10 and 78.8 against an armor class of 17. And at this point, even our half-caster Paladin is starting to output pretty darn good damage with their small group of skeletons. Looking at level 17, our full casters now have access to 9th level spells, and committing all of their spells, except for 1 3rd level spell slot, into maintaining would give our Cleric or other full casters an army of 98 or 94 skeletons for the Druid and the Bard. And it would take them about 4 days to raise that army, and they could do 421.4 DPR against an enemy with an armor class of 10 and 232.8 against an enemy with an armor class of 18. Now, our Necromancer Wizard continues to go off the rails and is looking at more than double this damage output because their army of now 102 skeletons has 17 extra health and does 6 extra damage per shot. So their skeletons have 30 health now. So a Necromancer's skeletons might not die in one hit at this level, even with that, which is kind of crazy. but they would be doing almost 900 DPR, 897.6 against an enemy with an armor class of 10, and 487.1 against an enemy with an armor class of 18. Even a single skeleton from the wizard is doing about just under 9 DPR against an armor class of 10, and right around 4.5 against an armor class of 18. And this is a lot of damage. Even with a small group of skeletons, the Necromancer Wizard could pump out a lot of damage, even with a small group. Our Paladin now has a 5th level spell slot and can make 38 skeletons. And again, they could raise this army in 3 days, and against an armor class of 10, do 305.9 DPR, and against an armor class of 18, 166.3. Now, these numbers are pretty crazy, but we got to talk about, importantly, some things to consider. First of all, how many skeletons is too many? And, you know, that Necromancer Wizard at level 17, using their 9th level spell slots and down, all the way to except for 1/3, to maintain an army of 102 skeletons, that's probably too many skeletons. And this is an important factor to consider if you want to play any kind of Necromancy build, is how many permanent summons is too many. And I think, in my opinion, once it starts to get over 10, it's going to start to get a little silly. So keep that in mind. And again, importantly, talk with your DM. That's the biggest thing about doing anything like this with this particular spell. Another thing to consider is that the skeletons are extremely squishy and will likely die in one hit. The 17th level Necromancer Wizard skeletons do have 30 HP, so they might not die in one hit. But if your skeletons are grouped up pretty tight and they get hit by a fireball, for example, even if they succeed on their save, they'll probably all die on average. They will all, it'll do 14 damage and they'll all die. So even if you have a big army, the DPR from the skeletons may not last for very long. And if the enemies focus on them, you're going to lose a lot of time and spell slot investment potentially on that. So that's something to consider. Is that, yeah, the skeletons could die very quickly. Also, it may not be practical to use all of your spell slots above level 3 for skeletons. You might need them for control or utility or to do other kinds of things, and that is totally understandable. But if you can use them all for skeletons, as you saw from the numbers, you can output some pretty silly things. So, thanks for watching. That has been Animate Dead. Next week, we will go into part 2 of this series on Necromancy, and I will be covering the 6th level spell Create Undead, which is the other Necromancy spell that's available to players. So thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.